Member for Randenburg St. George's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in support of a measure that provides support for the brave men and women of Canadian Armed Forces and Canadian veterans to whom we owe so much. My concern is that while Bill C-27 may provide support for a small number of service members and veterans, it doesn't do nearly enough. Bill C-27 is designed to amend the Public Service Employment Act to provide increased access to hiring opportunities in the public service for certain current and former members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, Mr. Speaker, in Randenburg and St. George's, we have over 700 men and women who are serving in all branches of the military. And it is those young men and women who I think about whenever we talk about veterans and we talk about going to war and we talk about the repercussions of the experiences that they have. The proposed legislation, Bill C-27, will ensure priority is given to Canadian Armed Forces members who are released because of service-related illness or injury, and will extend eligibility to reservists and Canadian Rangers. Bill C-27 will also provide increased access to internal public service postings for eligible members and veterans and increase their period of eligibility. And this all sounds very good, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree that these changes are indeed positive steps. But what they are not, Mr. Speaker, is a substitute for a real plan to ease the transition of service members and veterans into civilian employment. The government can and must do more to assist veterans find work following their military service. Unfortunately, nothing in Bill C-27 actually ensures that veterans will get jobs. Mr. Speaker, we know that helping veterans find jobs is a crucial step in their return to civilian life and well-being upon release from the military. Under normal circumstances, placing injured veterans at the head of the civil service hiring line and increasing access to veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces would be considered a valuable commitment and something to be applauded. In this instance, however, the promise is being made by a government that has already cut 20,000 public service jobs and is on track to cut 30,000 more. Regrettably, Bill C-27 appears poised to have little impact on the day-to-day lives of the majority of Canadian veterans. In the words of Jerry Kovacs, a director with the Canadian Veterans Advocacy, quote, "In theory, it is a good bill. Initiatives to hire veterans are good initiatives. But if there are no jobs, how can there be any priority hiring? So it's kind of a hollow promise." End of quote. After years of cuts and hiring freezes, there are fewer civil service jobs for veterans to fill than ever before. Bill C-27 does nothing for veterans who may be too ill or too injured to work. In his recent report, Guy Perron, the Veterans Ombudsman, stated that, and I quote, "Severely impaired veterans can face a lifetime of loss of employment and career progression opportunities." End of quote. Simply put, even injured veterans who are already entitled to government assistance are not receiving it. The Veterans Ombudsman's report indicated nearly half of the country's most severely disabled ex-soldiers are not receiving a government allowance intended to compensate them for their physical and mental wounds. The Ombudsman also concluded that many of those who are receiving the permanent impairment allowance are only being awarded the lowest grade of the benefit, which is the minimum amount. Mr. Speaker, the federal government also has an obligation to assist injured and ill veterans find jobs when they are released from the Canadian Armed Forces, but Bill C-27 should not replace the government's responsibility to help injured CAF members stay in the force when that is their wish. Furthermore, there is a genuine concern that soldiers may hide health problems so they won't lose their income. The Conservative government must do everything it can to ensure Canadian Armed Forces personnel suffering from physical and mental injuries need not fear being set adrift and having to keep their wounds secret in order to qualify for their pensions. Recently released government statistics show that approximately 1,100 of the 6,200 soldiers discharged because of health conditions since 2009 were unable to serve the 10-year minimum required to collect a full pension. Under the existing policy, many Canadian Armed Forces personnel face the dilemma of having to choose between risking their physical and mental health or risking their financial future. Soldiers suffering from PTSD and other ailments can either avoid seeking help in the hope of making it to pension eligibility or seek necessary care and risk losing their pensions. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-27 is clearly just the latest example of the Conservative government attempting to hide their inaction on the many issues affecting CAF members and veterans today. The Conservatives boast how much they support our soldiers and care about veterans and their families, but the facts show otherwise. Shamefully, the Conservative government continues to abdicate its responsibility to care for Canadian veterans. A few months ago, the Minister of Veterans Affairs called into question the social and legal responsibility Canada has to its soldiers. On at least 2 separate occasions since then, the Minister of Veterans Affairs has literally turned his back on veterans and their families who have come to Ottawa to voice their concerns about the lack of respect and support they have been receiving from the Conservative government. When the Conservative government closed 9 regional Veterans Affairs offices throughout the country, including one in Corner Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador, and committed to eliminating 781 jobs from the Department of Veterans Affairs by 2014-15, they claimed they were doing so in an attempt to cut costs. Meanwhile, the Conservative government continues to spend millions of taxpayers' dollars on partisan advertising while neglecting Canada's veterans. And then at the last minute, Mr. Speaker, when they know the Auditor General's report is coming out, they come out with a pot of goodies that we know are promises and promises only. In his report today, the Auditor General concluded that Veterans Affairs is largely unconcerned with how well veterans are being served and whether programs are making a difference in their lives. While $1.13 billion in funding for veterans has gone unspent since the Conservative government took power, veterans have been forced to wait months for the mental health services they so desperately need. According to the Auditor General's report, about 15,000 veterans and serving military personnel were eligible to receive health support from Veterans Affairs through the Disability Benefits Program at the end of last March. The number is expected to increase as more veterans of the Afghanistan campaign leave the military for civilian life in the coming years. Over the past decade, 160 Canadian Armed Forces members have died by suicide. And Mr. Speaker, 158 died serving in Afghanistan. Many more of our veterans continue to struggle with mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Auditor General's report confirms what Liberals have long maintained, which is that the Conservative government simply isn't doing enough to help our veterans and their families who have sacrificed so much for their country. They have put their lives on the line, and some have paid the ultimate sacrifice. Yet, we are not there for them in the way that we need to be. As Canadians, we owe a debt of gratitude to our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, and to their families. They require assistance in so many ways. Unfortunately, because the Conservatives are refusing to respond to the needs of our veterans, they are being forced to mobilize in a variety of ways in order to get their message out about how unfairly they are being treated. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-27 does very little to address a much larger problem. This bill is a step in the right direction, and my colleague has said that. But there is much that still needs to be done. It is time for this government to start treating our veterans and their families with the respect that they have earned and the respect that they deserve from those of us who get to live a much better life and those throughout the world who get to live under better circumstances because of their efforts. This begins by listening to the concerns being raised by those who have already sacrificed so much, instead of ignoring them when they reach out for help, which unfortunately the Conservative government continues to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Random Buren St. George for her remarks. In fact, one of the highlights from my time sailing aboard HMCS St. John's was traveling with Lieutenant Governor House and his wife on an outports visit through her riding, including small communities like Francois and some really charming parts of Canada. Some wonderful people in her riding. I'm going to ask her the same question I asked her colleague from Guelph. So for veterans that, after active service, whether traditional war veterans or newer veterans, when they return to Stephenville or Marystown or some of the smaller communities in her riding, have they been using a bricks and mortar Veterans Affairs office, or have they been receiving support mainly from veteran service officers at Legions in many of those towns?
The honourable member for Random Buren St. George's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in response to my colleague, if you were in Francois and McCallum and La Poyle, you were indeed in my riding. And it is one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And it is also a riding where, as I mentioned earlier, we have so many men and women who get involved in the military and do so much on behalf of, to represent Canada fighting wars abroad. Mr. Speaker, the veterans in Random Buren St. George's avail of whatever services are available to them, whether it be in a building or whether it be through other services or whether they try and use the internet. A lot of them, of course, do not use the internet, and when you're talking about going back and returning to rural communities, it is much easier if there is a short drive, Mr. Speaker, for instance, to go from a small community like Stephenville or Stephenville Crossing to Corner Brook. They have now, the Conservatives have now closed that office in Corner Brook. So now for any of those veterans to drive, it's now a 3.5-hour drive at least to St. John's to be able to avail of the same service that they could have availed of before the government chose to close the office in Corner Brook.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for St. Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. And as she pointed out, and as we have all pointed out, we can never do enough for our veterans to honor their service and everything they do in their missions. In this bill, Mr. Speaker, there is a fairly large stumbling block with regard to the taking into account of our veterans who are victims of PTSD, and there is a problem with the administrative timelines as to when this PTSD is taken into account. For example, these are veterans for whom perhaps the PTSD does not come to light until later. And this bill needs to take that into account. What does my colleague think?
Member for Random Buren St. George's.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for her question and her recognition of how serious this issue is with respect to those who served in the military and who returned suffering from PTSD. There should not be a window. The service should be available to a veteran whenever it's determined that they need to avail of the services. And as my colleague has said, in a lot of cases, it may not even present itself very soon after the veteran returns home. So to put a window in place, a time frame in which they have to work, is really unfair, and again points to the lack of support for our veterans who need to be able to avail of whatever services are available to them as our way of thanking them for the sacrifices that they have made on behalf of Canadians.
Time for a very short question. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for her comments. I have noticed she's a very strong advocate for her community on a wide variety of issues, very passionate, obviously, about our veterans. And my question to her is just if she can provide comment at a time in which we have seen, and she makes reference to the offices that have been closed down, at the same time in which we find out that the government has held back in terms of expending money in the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars towards vets.
Short answer from the honourable member for Random Buren St. George's, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question because it is something that I think we almost find unbelievable that this could happen when we talk about our veterans. Veterans who were given so much and who could use so much more in terms of support in recognition of the sacrifices they've made, yet this government has turned around and cut funding, or they've not used funding that's been there specifically to help our veterans. Instead, they've let it go back to the Treasury to be used for other purposes, including partisan advertising, which should never, never be done on the backs of those most vulnerable, which includes our veterans.